Hello, my name is John Lind, and today I will be showing you how to add instances to your release ops pipeline. But before we begin, understand that this is meant for those who have already gotten the standard dev test prod sample pipeline up and running and are interested in learning how to add a fourth instance, such as UAT or staging. This link has configuration documentations and a video, so if you need help getting things set up, you should use this link. And at the start of this session, I am going to show you the MIF, the Multi-Instance Management Framework configurations that you will need. Just as you need MIF configured to work with dev test, you'll also need to insert your new instance into MIF as well using the instructions found at this link. But we will review that, but not cover the details of how to do that here. So, what are we trying to do? In our particular situation, we have a UAT instance that exists between prod and test. And so we need to inject that into our pipeline. And I'm going to show you how to do that. If you need guidance on how to do a sample deployment, as I will be doing today, I will breeze past it, but you can watch this video for details on how to do a deployment from dev to test. And in our case, it will soon be dev, test, UAT, prod. Okay, to start with, as I mentioned a second ago, we need to check on our multi-instance management framework. So we'll do multi-instance, and we will go to the managed instances. This defines which instances the prod controller can access, and the prod controller needs to be able to access all of the subprod instances that will be feeding into it using ReleaseOps. In my case, I added YUAT and it has been approved. Again, use the instructions on the slide I showed you a second ago to get your new instance attached to multi-instance management and confirm that uh, the record is approved before proceeding. So the next thing we need to do is we need to create a release ops deployment instance. And a deployment instance is just a reference to that multi-instance management framework instance that we'll use to configure a pipeline. So as you can see, I've got XYZ, but there is no UAT instance in here yet. So I will add that now. So let's select YUAT. And in this case, I'm going to make the instance type test. The idea here is that a pipeline is a source, which is your dev instance, is a target, which is your production instance. And as far as release ops is concerned, everything in between is preparing for that deployment to production and is therefore a test instance. I haven't tried it. I believe you could create your own custom instance type, but for the purposes of release ops kind of doesn't care. Anything that's a test instance just means it's one of the middle instances in the pipeline. So the next thing I need to do is I need to create a pipeline label. So as we create our new playbook to manage the deployment assessments and deploy to UAT, we don't want to reference those instances directly. If you were to hard code the instance to a specific instance, like for UAT, into your playbook, if anything changes, your configuration changes, you have different playbooks with different activities, you need a label that describes abstracts that and describes the purpose of the instance versus just the instance's name and URL. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a UAT label now. UAT, and I am going to submit. Cool. So let's go look at the anatomy of a pipeline. The sample release pipeline is what we'll be working from. And you'll see that it has two playbooks. The first playbook is responsible for everything up until production. And the release playbook is basically responsible for that last step into production. In this way, you may have different processes feeding the lower environments, but then use a standardized release deployment playbook to get to production. So before we go modify the playbook, let's do one last thing. we need to go add the remote instance setup so that UAT is able to pull the update sets from test, and the prod instance is able to pull update sets from UAT. So to do that, let's start with prod, and we will go to update sources, and you'll see I've already added UAT. This is all covered in the configuration documentation on how to set these up. And then we need to go to UAT itself and make sure that it's pointing to test. And you'll see that we have one pointing to test. Reminder, we are now returning to prod to do the rest of the configuration in this video. Immediately before going to create our new playbook, be sure that you are in the ReleaseOps application scope. Then go to the Workflow Studio. And the standard starter playbook we're going to use is the deployment request assessment. I'm not even going to jump into it. Instead, I'm going to check it, and I'm going to hit the duplicate button. I'm going to name this deployment request assessment for instances. Now that we're here, you can see kind of how it works. There are stages for moving to test, a stage for running those ATF tests in test environment, and then it switches to ready for deployment. We want to inject a stage between there. And we are going to call this one move to UAT. Save and close. So the process we're going to implement is that as soon as everything passes ATF testing in the test environment, we will immediately move to UAT. You may have a more complex process, but for the purposes of showing you how to do this in the demo, we will use that simple process. So now I'm going to add an activity, and the activity is in ReleaseOps, and it's called Integrate Deployment Request. And we'll leave that name the same, and we will go to automation. So where do we get the source deployment instance from? Again, we don't want to hard code it, but luckily we have a previous step that is aware of the instance that it deployed to, and that is the integrate deployment step, which was the movement to test. And we will say the destination deployment instance, that's the input. So the destination instance label, remember we created one called UAT. Now I'm going to select that now. And then finally, the deployment request, we would use the picker and just grab the parent record, which is a deployment request as well, of course. In order to use this playbook, you'll need to activate it. Next, we will be creating the duplicate of the release playbook. And remember, this is the one that takes the code to prod. Since we have added a UAT step as the last step before prod, we need to create one that will pull from UAT instead of pulling from test as the default does. To do this, return to Workflow Studio and make a duplicate of the release deployment playbook. We will call it release deployment from UAT. Then we will take the very first step, prepare for release, and you'll see that there is a pre-prod instance label, and we're going to change that from test to UAT, save and close, and activate the playbook so that we can use it in our pipeline. So I will go back to ReleaseOps. I will go to pipelines, and I'm going to open up the sample release pipeline, and I'm going to use Fred Luddy's favorite feature, insert and stay. So I'm going to call this sample release pipeline with UAT, and I'm going to do an insert and stay. So I'm going to select the new playbook that we just created. Update this, clone to record, and return to it. I need to add the pipeline instances. So what the pipeline instances are, you don't define pipeline instances for the starting location, the dev environment, because that's specified as part of the deployment request. So you may have multiple dev environments that are feeding into this pipeline, dev 1, dev 2, dev 3, something like that. And then the target is defined in the release itself. So what the pipeline instances do is they describe everything in the middle. So we'll need one for test and we'll need one for UAT. I'm going to create those now. So I am going to use the deployment instance of Yo-Yo. So this is the move to test. Yo-Yo is my test instance, and the label is going to be test. And I'm going to do the same. I'm going to do the same for UAT. So the deployment instance is Y UAT, and the label is UAT. So this pipeline should be ready to go. It's already active. So now all I need to do is create a release. The destination environment is going to be Zorb, which is the current instance I'm on. Instead of using the sample release pipeline, I'm going to use the one with UAT. Don't forget to switch the state to active or you won't be able to reference it from your um, dev instance. So to test this out, I'm going to run to my dev instance, create an update set, attach it to this release, and then we'll continue from there. And the release is the YUAT demo pipeline release. Excellent. So all I have to do now is use the ready to assess button, which will initiate the assessment pipeline. So while that's running, a good question would be, what do I do if things don't work out? Well, as luck would have it, when I was running this demo the first time, I made a mistake and I had to track it down. So what we want to go do is we want to look for the playbook executions. And I can do the playbook administration, today's executions, and I can look at one of my previous runs. So this is the first one I did where I had some issues. If you'll look through here, what happened was there was an error logged on the activity log for that deployment request as it tried to transition to UAT. And that is, again, the integrate deployment request step. So looking at this, you can see the first one here is the move to test lane. And the one that I was having an issue with was the move to UAT. So I use the integrate deployment request label. I drill into here. And you can see this open flow and operations view. So this will give you a visual view of the different steps of that workflow. You can see I got an error caught on the very first step, get deployment instance. And if I click on this, you'll see no record found in the lookup record action, context ID, pipeline label.label equals. So what had happened is I had was referencing a label that had been deleted, which meant that step couldn't figure out which instance to deploy to. Um, but using this technique, you can look at the different steps of the playbook itself and then drill into the flows that are supporting each of those steps. The other thing this allows you to do is when you go to the playbook execution, you can preview in the playbook. There will be direct playbook integration coming in Australia, but this is a little shortcut to get you there. In the meantime, you can see the playbook in action. Excellent. So you can see the record has updated. It was deployed to Yo-Yo. There were no tests associated. Had there been, they would have executed. And then it started moving update tests to UAT, completed that, and then changed the state to ready for deployment. And this deployment request is ready to go to prod. Here are some useful links. Thank you very much and happy coding.